Hello and welcome to Gin with Gwyn. I'm Oliver Gwyn, and this is where I give you my informal and unrehearsed thoughts on marketing, data, and philosophy. This week I'm talking about client comms, and yes, that doesn't really fit into any of those three categories, which were broad enough to begin with, but I thought it would be an interesting thing to speak about. I spent most of my working life agency side, and client comms are always tricky, so I wanted to go over some real basic fundamental stuff today, which maybe will be useful and interesting to you, whether you work for an agency or you are a client. Maybe you've not thought about these things on the opposite side before. The first thing is, who is responsible for client comms from an agency? My answer to this is everybody is responsible, bro, at different levels. So typically you have a project lead on a particular account, it could be an account director or something like that, and they're the main person that is responsible for communicating with that client, and they have the overall say about what is said to that particular client. Now, I've worked in different agencies and I've seen this work different ways. I've seen it work where that person is the only person who is allowed to sort of respond to clients, and they're responsible for all of the communications. And I've also seen it where anybody on the project can talk to the clients, but if it's important, they probably need to ask the client director or the account lead or the project lead, is this okay to say? Personally, I think it wastes a lot of time and energy to have everybody have to refer back to them. I think that you should generally trust your people and give them access to the client at the end of the day. I don't think you need to worry so much about people saying the wrong thing if they are aligned with you and what the goals of the project are. It just delays things for them having to ask you and then ask the client and all this kind of stuff. You're delaying things and making them more complicated, and it feels a bit micromanaging in my opinion. So hopefully you've got a team that you trust in place, and they feel comfortable that they can handle those things without having to go to the project lead all the time. But for important things, for strategic things, for big updates, I can understand it makes sense to go to the project lead, especially if there's any sort of dispute or argument or difference of opinions. That would be the case where the project leads to sign that off. And certainly I believe that whether you're a project lead or you're working on a project or you're really junior, whoever it is, it's always good sometimes just to share messages and check that everybody's happy with them. Sometimes somebody has a different opinion or a different style of writing that might just be a little bit more suitable. So that's your project leads. Then you've got people working on the project. And as I say, I believe that it's best that those people can talk directly to the client. It can seriously slim down the amount of work behind the scenes if everything doesn't have to go through one particular person. But there's also a third person from the agency, and these are people who might not even be involved in the project, and they're sort of side characters. They are different voices. This could be the salespeople who originally talked to the client. They're very important to keep throughout the process. Don't just hand off to your product team and then disappear, because these are people who have built relationships with that client to begin with. They know that client. They have normally good instincts about what that client wants, what's important to them. They're spoken to them in the first degree, how they are as people, what they've emphasized as being important during the pitching phase. And so they shouldn't disappear later. They're often very useful people just to keep a track of the project and to come back in later maybe as a different voice. And different voices are useful where maybe you're having a personality conflict with somebody, you're not quite sure how to communicate with somebody. It could just be that you're having a problem and you want somebody different to explain things. We sometimes do projects where it's with marketing teams. I did marketing for 10 years. And so if the team are having troubles with somebody and they don't quite understand the pain points of what they're saying, I might just come in and I know exactly the stress that these marketing people are under and what their concerns are and what they're worried about. And I naturally will speak the same language without having to think about what I'm saying. And so I'll get on with those people a lot better. We'll get a lot further bringing in another voice. Another voice isn't suddenly a new project leader or it's not working out. It's just somebody else that might just pop in and say, hey, let's have a quick chat, let's sort this out. And sometimes just by being a different person than somebody who's already been involved a lot, they can help sort out issues a lot quicker. So I think having other people with a general overview of what's happening in the project is really, really useful for agencies, but it's not a technique that I see happen all the time. Those people need a good brief from your team if they can't be involved in all the day-to-day, because it's just going to slow them down. But a different voice can often be the right person to bring out when you have difficulties, instead of it having to rely solely on like a project lead. Who is involved in the relationship between clients and agencies. There's three people. You've got your agency, you've got your client, but you've also got, sadly, a third person that you have to consider in all of your client communications, which is legal. I would love to sit here and tell you that the world is lovely and every client is perfect and there aren't conflicts, but that's not the world we live in. I think anybody who's run an agency or been a freelancer or worked for themselves knows firsthand that, especially when you're starting out, I think it's very true that you will naturally attract people who are less honorable. They will go back on the word. You can't sadly trust everyone on the word. And so you need to make sure that you cover your bum. And the golden rule with all client comms is quite simply cover your bum, get everything in writing. Now, it depends where you are in the world, depending on your legal system, but there's never any harm in having some sort of evidence. Ambiguity is your enemy when you are an agency, and it's also not good for the end client. So for any decision that needs to be made, it's not good enough that it's just quickly said. It needs to be reinforced in writing. If you have a phone call with someone, you then need to send them an email to say, this is what we agree with, dum, 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 dum. Do you agree with that, basically? And you need to make sure that you get that in writing, because one day something might go wrong, relationship might break down, and you will have to refer back to this and say, the client might say, I never agreed to that. Here's your evidence. And it's sad that that's the case, that you're having to think about that throughout. And I don't think you should worry about that. But that is the way that you have to operate, unfortunately, as a business and certainly as an agency. I don't know if you've ever watched the program Suits, but the main character, one of the main characters in that, Harvey Specter, is a lawyer. He has a mantra that I think is really good, which is always avoid going to court, because you never know what will happen in court. My friends in America might think that's quite odd, because they're a lot more litigious than people here in Europe. But I think it's true. In the UK, if you have a problem with another business, most likely, depending on the amount of money and depending if it's like a legal issue, if it's not a wider legal issue, it's just a dispute, basically, you go to small claims court and a judge, he or she, will make a decision on your case. And even if they order somebody to pay the money or whatever it is, you then have to, follow that up. It's not a fun process necessarily, but your decision is in the hands of one person, basically, and you have no idea if this person has a business background. Quite possibly they don't have a business background, so they won't appreciate your business. And so you need to collect black and white evidence to present to that judge. You also have to bear in mind that these cases, it's not like you're going to be in court for an entire day or something. You need to make them really short, really concise, and really obvious. So when we think about kinds of evidence, recordings. Everybody is recording their meetings right now, or they're using some sort of AI note taker to find notes. Does that count as evidence? No. You might think, well, surely it's better to have than nothing. Yes, it's useful to have, but in most cases, somebody can just claim that, well, I said that in that meeting, but it was just off the cuff, or they caught me off guard, and I wasn't really sure what to say, or I said yes in that instance, but I didn't really mean it. And I think in meetings, that's quite possible. I could say yes to something and then later go, actually, no, that wasn't the right thing to say. And so while a yes in a meeting is useful, or a yes on the phone is useful, or a yes in person is useful, you always have to back that up in writing. Whenever you have a meeting, you need to send an email, because an email is proven evidence that will be accepted into court. It says, this is what we're talking about. Do you agree? And you need to get a yes from them, because once you've got that, there is no ambiguity. Now, you might be wondering, what about Slack? What about Messenger? What about communication systems? So they have been admitted into court, but there have also been cases in where the person owned, the company owned their Slack, and they went in and edited the messages so it didn't say the thing that the person said. And they did this before the dispute got any further. So before even the thought of court was needed, and somebody thought, oh, I need this evidence, they went in and changed the messages. And luckily they were able to, the agency was able to sort of petition the court to get the records, and they went through and they found that they had edited it and they had a log of the originals. But in a lot of cases, that data could have already been deleted, or they're not going to go for that effort. And so if it's on a client's Slack or Messenger or Google or whatever it might be, that's not good enough. Now, a screenshot of that is useful. Certainly, it's good evidence. But if it's a key decision in a project and you are waiting for it, you should always back that up with an email. Again, it's sad that we have to think this way, but it's to protect our own selves. When we are following up with people, there's a couple of things that we really need to think about. One is we don't know somebody's workload. We don't know their schedule. We don't know their dependencies. We don't know their chain often. We don't know if they need to go to their boss and then their boss needs to sign off, or they need to send it to somebody. That person needs to send it back. We don't know their style of communication. We don't know their system preferences of how they like to be communicated to. Maybe they don't even check the Slack. So if you message them 2 times on Slack to chase them, that's useless because they're an email person. And of course, we don't know their mood. So we don't know if maybe we've angered them that particular day by chasing them, and so they've just ignored our message. And so as an agency, when we are communicating with people, especially if we're chasing people and we want to make sure that we get black and white communication, the most difficult people are the people who ghost us, or they take a long time coming back to us. The first thing is we need to make it really obvious what we want. And instead of sending 4 or 5 messages throughout the day, we need to send one consolidated message if that makes it easier. Always make it as easy as possible. Put things in bullet points of the decisions you make. Don't make any kind of ambiguity there. So make it really obvious. Second thing is, in every communication, you should put 2 things, especially when it's escalated. It's no good just saying, oh, okay, can you give me some feedback on this? You need to put consequences and deadlines. Consequences sounds quite harsh, but you need to say, hey, I need you to review this document by Friday. Otherwise, I will be delayed by a day, or the next part will be delayed by a day, which will then cost you money. That's really important. So make it obvious, include a consequence and a deadline. And in the first case, maybe just using Slack or Google or whatever is completely fine. If it's the second time that you're then following up with that, probably you do want to include an email at that point, just so that you've got the evidence that you've then followed up a second time. And of course, always be polite, always be friendly, always say, oh, I know you're so busy, but if you could do this, that'd be great. Always do that, and always thank them for taking the time out, because people are really busy. Don't underestimate that. And then finally, if it's going to start impacting the project, that's the point where you start taking the choice away, start taking away the options. Because if you're waiting for options, maybe you'll be waiting a long time. So that point, and I don't like doing this, but you will have to say, hey, I've been chasing you for a choice between A and B. At this point, I believe A is what is best for you. If I do not hear contrary to you by this date, I'm going to go ahead with it. Now, maybe they will come back to you a week later and say, oh, no, B. They say, well, it's too late. I've already made that decision, and you can't argue against it because I've chased you 3 times. Here's the evidence. And people know, people know that they can't necessarily argue with it. It's not good to take away people's choices, but sometimes that is what we need to do to make sure that we meet our deadlines and our contractual obligations, because inevitably what you don't want to do is get into a situation where, 1, somebody says, well, I never signed that off, where's the evidence of that? And 2, they say, well, you're late now, so that null and voids our contract, and anything that after that is basically an argument. So if it's something that can cause a delay, it's really important, or it involves money, so you're going to have to charge more money to somebody, always ensure that you get everything in writing. If you're struggling to communicate with somebody, involve side characters, and remember that everybody is in charge of communicating with the client. And sometimes your job is not necessarily to be the most informed person on the project or to give those important updates. Sometimes your job is just to be human and be likable and make a connection with people, because at the end of the day, we're all people, and a job is just a job. Nobody is trying to cause friction, I don't believe, at work. They're just trying to do their job in the best way possible, but we don't always meet eye to eye. So those are my tips for some basic client communication and covering our bums, because sadly that is the world that we live in. Hope this was useful. Let me know what you'd like me to talk about next week, and tune in for some more Gin with Gwyn.